Nuclear power is one of the cleanest forms of energy. When properly controlled, it is relatively safe. But when something goes wrong, the consequences can be grave. And not just for the people who work in the nuclear plant itself. Those nearby can also suffer. In April of 1986, this was the result of an explosion at the Chernobyl reactor in the Soviet Union. The worst peacetime nuclear disaster to date, it was caused by serious design and operating blunders. It affected tens of thousands of people. Chernobyl was an example of the many problems that would topple the Soviet Empire. The arms and space races with America had increased the pressure on its economy. The Soviet Union was forced to cut corners to match U.S. technology. This meant compromising safety. Before Chernobyl, there had been other less serious nuclear accidents, like the 1979 incident at 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Human error, combined with a faulty valve, caused its reactor core to overheat. Radioactive gases were released. A state of emergency was immediately declared. But thanks to a containment building that housed the reactor, only a small amount of gas escaped into the atmosphere. Even so, people who lived near the reactor were evacuated. Only a slight increase in local radioactivity levels was found. The leak was quickly plugged, and the emergency was soon over. Nevertheless, the accident reminded the world of the potential hazards of nuclear power. Those who lived near 3 Mile Island, as well as other nuclear power stations outside America, became uneasy. In the U.S., more stringent safety standards for the design of nuclear power stations were put in effect. But while much of the world took notice of the lessons of 3 Mile Island, the Soviet Union paid little attention. 7 years after the 3 Mile Island incident, the Soviet Union would pay the price for its complacency. The Chernobyl explosion on April 26, 1986, produced consequences much more grave than those caused by 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl is located in the Ukraine, close to the border of Belarus, and 80 miles north of Kiev. The reactor complex is 12 miles from the town of Chernobyl. Construction of the 4 reactors that make up the complex was carried out during the 1970s. But the complex came under investigation by the KGB for building violations and slipshod practices. This did not bode well for Chernobyl's future. Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB and later the Soviet premier, had to personally ensure that the building errors were corrected. When the reactors started coming online, there were more problems. In 1982, operational errors at the number 1 reactor led to the destruction of its central fuel assembly. There was an escape of radioactivity. In another incident, personnel doing repair work suffered severe doses of radiation. In 1983, Chernobyl's number 4 reactor came online with no public mention of the accidents that had occurred at the complex. The Soviet people continued to believe that their nuclear industry was among the safest in the world. Their complacency would soon be shattered. A 12-foot thick concrete disc separated the number 4 reactor's core from the refueling unit above it. The moderator, the main part of the core, consisted of a large graphite block that had uranium rods inserted in it. The reaction produced by this operation heated water pipes. This created steam, which powered turbines and produced electricity for the northern Ukraine. Nuclear power stations are not, however, self-sufficient in terms of electricity. They require some outside power to drive the pumps that distribute coolant around the reactor. If the reactor is in the process of being shut down and there is no outside source of electricity available, then generators within the plant can be used. But there is a time lapse before they come online. During this time, it is critical that there is sufficient residual power in the turbine to maintain the cooling system. On April 25, 1986, the staff at Chernobyl's number 4 reactor began a test to ensure that the freewheeling turbine could drive the cooling system. The reactor itself would not be shut down. It would merely be isolated by cutting off the steam line to the turbine. Residual energy in the turbine could then be measured. But authorities in Kiev requested a delay in conducting the test, so that electrical service was available until late evening. After reducing power, technicians halted preparations for the test. It would be conducted during the next shift, which began at midnight. The night shift made further power reductions in the reactor. They also shut off the emergency systems to prevent the test from being aborted. This meant that if something went wrong, the technicians would have to react very quickly to prevent an accident. Yet they seemed oblivious to the danger. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, the shift workers on duty at Chernobyl's number 4 reactor continued to reduce power in preparation for a test. By 12:30 a.m., the power had fallen below normal safe operating levels. Normally, emergency systems would automatically cut in to restore power levels, but they had been switched off. The operators could still rectify the situation by preventing the power from falling further, but for some reason, this did not happen. The power level continued to drop until it was almost zero. At the same time, the core was showing signs of overheating. Even though there was something clearly wrong, no attempt was made to abort the test. The operators pressed on. Eventually, they realized that they were still losing power while overheating. The operators retracted some of the control rods. This restored some power, but overheating increased, as did a buildup of steam. This created a massive surge of power. To counteract this, an operator pressed the emergency button, which caused the rods to re-enter the core. As he did, there was an even more massive surge of power. This shattered fuel pellets, which reacted with the cooling water and produced a pulse of high pressure. The fuel pipes ruptured. Daylight revealed the impact of the two explosions, one fuel, the other steam, that immediately followed. The protective concrete cap over the reactor had been blown off. Incoming air had reacted with the graphite moderator blocks, creating carbon monoxide. This caused a fire, which quickly destroyed the tar-coated reactor roof. Unlike Western reactors, those at Chernobyl were not protected by containment buildings. This meant that huge amounts of radioactive material were released into the atmosphere. Within the reactor itself, the now molten core glowed a sinister red. Surprisingly, only 2 people were killed in the explosions, but more fatalities would follow. For those at Ground Zero, it was almost impossible to grasp the enormity of what had happened. At the time, they did not realize that besides the physical damage, radiation many times greater than that generated by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was now released into the atmosphere. The consequences were potentially devastating. Shortly after the explosions, the duty staff shut down the other 3 reactors at Chernobyl. But excessive Soviet secrecy now came into play. The nearby town of Pripyat, where many Chernobyl workers lived, was under radioactive threat. Unlike 3 Mile Island, no immediate emergency was declared. Moscow made no official announcement to the Soviet people. The radioactivity spread rapidly. Thanks to amateur radio hams and nuclear monitoring stations outside the Soviet Union, the world was made aware that a serious nuclear accident had taken place. The world demanded that Moscow explain what had caused the accident and what the Soviets were doing to limit the radiation threat. After the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet Army and civil defense personnel rushed to contain both the fire and the continuing escape of radiation. Brave volunteers in protective clothing got up onto the reactor building to assess the damage in more detail. To prevent the continuing escape of radiation, helicopters were organized to drop wet sand, lead, and boron carbide into the reactor's gaping hole. Aware that they were surrounded by a very high level of radioactivity, crews went to work in the skies above Chernobyl. Gradually, they filled the reactor's void. As for the people living near the reactor complex, 36 hours passed before the town of Pripyat was evacuated, and everyone living within 20 miles of Chernobyl sent away. Eventually, at least 116,000 people were moved, leaving Pripyat a ghost town. But the failure to institute prompt emergency procedures would later prove a problem. Many people in Kiev voluntarily left the city. The reservoir that provided most of their water had been contaminated within hours of the disaster. Distribution was later widened to include pregnant women and children in much of the Ukraine and the day of the blast, the heavier products of radiation spread west to Poland. By day 3, the fallout had spread across a huge swath of the Western Soviet Union and was approaching Western Europe. The following day, Scandinavia and Germany were affected. Within 10 days, the cloud covered most of Europe. Outside the Soviet Union, more stringent precautions were promptly taken. All aircraft flying from the western part of the Soviet Union were checked for radiation. So were their passengers. Reindeer herds, which support the livelihood of the Laplanders in northern Norway and Finland, were moved out of the way of the radioactive fallout. In Britain, a major concern was radioactivity in the food chain, especially milk supplies. Sheep were also checked for radiation. Those with above normal levels were destroyed. Back at Chernobyl itself, rescue workers continued to grapple with the situation. Even with protective clothing and gas masks, they could only spend short periods of time around the number 4 reactor. Many were exposed to high levels of radiation and had to be hospitalized. 28 rescue workers would die from overdoses within the next 3 months. The main concern was that the remains of the reactor core could break through the concrete base and fall into the water below, causing another explosion. Eventually, rescue workers managed to cut their way through to the reactor building and reduce its high temperature. By then, on May 9th, 1986, the 5,000 tons of sandbagged sand, clay, and boron, dropped by helicopters, collapsed into a cavity formed by the burning graphite in the reactor core. Another radioactive cloud resulted. It settled on everything within the 20-mile exclusion zone around the site. Worried about the possibility of another meltdown, authorities called in miners to tunnel under the reactor. They were eventually able to remove the danger. Work then began on the construction of a huge concrete sarcophagus to encase the reactor and prevent the escape of any more radiation. It was a formidable task. Eventually, the work was completed, and Chernobyl reactor number 4 was declared safe. The other 3 reactors at Chernobyl were reactivated to meet demands for electricity. Safety procedures were now strictly enforced. The blunders that resulted in the Chernobyl disaster were blamed on the plant's director and the technicians who conducted the tests that went so terribly wrong. 6 of them were put on trial and found guilty of carrying out illegal operations and disregarding safety regulations. But it was the Soviet system, with its secrecy and disregard for safety, that was ultimately responsible for the blunders. Their legacy remains in the exclusion zone around Chernobyl that is now a wasteland. But it is the children who have suffered the most. They have experienced a marked increase in the number of thyroid cancer cases. As for Chernobyl's number 4 reactor, the sarcophagus encasing it is in danger of collapse. If it does, there will be another release of radioactivity. The Ukraine has insufficient funds to deal with the problem, but a European consortium has drawn up plans for a new concrete structure to cover the reactor. The intent is that this would make the reactor safe for thousands of years. But there have been problems in raising the money for it. The threat of another nuclear disaster at Chernobyl remains.
The CIA came rushing in.
No one was to know about it. We were losing our oxygen.
No one would enter or leave this room until we had either landed or we had crashed.
Failure is not an option. Tonight at 8 on the History Channel. Even astronauts have heroes.